The Point Animate add-on by KIRI Engine simplifies the process of animating scans and models, allowing for the creation of motion graphic renders and VFX in just a few minutes. We recommend you watch the full documentation tutorial, but if you're pushed for time, we'll start with the most important notes and a quick guide to get you started. Just like any animation operations in Blender, the number of faces or vertices a model has will greatly affect performance. If animating meshes, you should consider using a low poly object rather than a raw scan. Get into the habit of using the bake functions to boost performance. Quick guide. Full controls are available for all animation presets, but for beginners, 4 quick presets are available. These are a good starting point before adjusting controls manually. For this quick guide, we'll use a quick preset. Import an object. Your object can be a regular mesh, OBJ or FBX, or a point cloud object, a PLY file. Select your object and from the add-on, choose a quick preset. I'm going to choose Quick Dissolve. A new window will open with settings for the chosen preset. For Quick Dissolve, I can specify the start frame and end frame for my animation to begin and end. Specify if my input is a point cloud or a mesh. I'm using a mesh, so I select Input Mesh, and then I select my mesh's color texture, its diffuse texture. This will help to color the points. After hitting OK, I play my timeline from start to end. It's okay for a start, but I can see that the wind and noise modifiers are enabled. I can tweak the parameters for these 2 modifiers to get something more to my liking. When I'm happy with my settings, I can go into each modifier and hit Bake. This will lock the settings for each modifier, but will improve playback performance. Now we'll have a look at the full documentation covering all controls. Installation. The add-on was made with Blender 4.2. The add-on may have some functions with earlier versions of Blender, but full usability can't be guaranteed. To install the add-on, make sure you've downloaded the zip file Point Animate by KIRI Engine. Drag and drop the zip file from a file browser into the Blender window. An install dialog will appear. Press OK. The add-on can now be found in the 3D viewport. Pressing the N key will bring up or hide the N panel where you can find the add-on. Adding modifiers and quick presets. Before any modifiers are added to the active object, the add-on interface will show 5 buttons for adding the required modifiers. Add Point Animate modifiers will add all the animation modifiers, but leave their settings at default values, and all modifiers will be disabled. This is best for a user who wants complete control to build their animation from the ground up. The 4 quick presets, Quick Dissolve, Quick Magic, Quick Morph, and Quick Tech, will add the modifiers and enable some with specific setting values. This is good for beginners who are a bit intimidated by a huge settings list at first. After pressing a quick preset button, a window will be shown to specify the start frame and end frame, the beginning and end of your animation. Some preset-specific settings will also be shown. For some presets, you need to specify the input-output type of your object. If your object is a point cloud, you should choose input equals points. If your object is a mesh and you choose input equals points, your mesh will be converted to points, and the animation will output only points. If your object is a mesh and you choose input mesh, you will be asked to select the color diffuse texture of your object to color the points. Hit OK and the preset settings will be applied. Interface overview. Once an object has been given the Point Animate modifiers, the full interface will be shown. The interface is split into 4 sections. The Add Effectors section can be used to add objects that don't render, to use as wind controllers or as mask objects. The Global Settings area shows settings that will affect every modifier that is enabled. So these settings are always visible if your object has point animate modifiers. We'll go into these settings further later on. The layer stack will show which modifiers are currently enabled and will let you enable or disable a modifier by clicking its corresponding button. Be aware that wind and morph modifiers can't be enabled together, hence their buttons sitting side by side. Enabling one will disable the other. The active settings will let you choose which modifier you want to see the settings for. Global settings. Here we can see settings that affect every modifier applied to your object. A warning will show if the rotation or scale of your object is not applied. Having unapplied rotations or scales can lead to unexpected animation behavior. You can always apply rotation and scale with Ctrl-A in the viewport. If your input object is a mesh, you can specify its diffuse color texture to color the points. This option won't show if your object is a point cloud. By default, your animated points are given the point animate material, but you can specify any material you want to use. If your input and animated output includes a mesh, you can specify the mesh material here. The start frame and end frame will let you control when the animation begins and ends. In point scale, you set the radius of your points. Randomize will mix between the min and max point sizes. If randomize is set to 0, only the minimum scale will be considered. Depending on which modifiers are enabled, attribute influence may be shown to automatically change the point scale. We'll cover this more in the attribute influence section. The viewport display lets you limit how many points are shown in the viewport. This doesn't affect renders at all, it's only a viewport-based setting. It can be useful when you want to preview renders quickly in the viewport. Attribute influence. For beginners unfamiliar with geometry nodes or attributes, this may be the most confusing part of the add-on, but it should quickly become clear, especially if you play with the add-on a few times. Any visible value in the add-on and the regular Blender UI can be keyframed to control animations. But keyframing every setting in the add-on would be ridiculously time-consuming, so we can use attributes to automatically drive settings values. For example, in this drop-down, I can see attributes that I can use to control the point scale. Attributes with the word timeline in their name means that they will change between the start frame and end frame that you specify for the timeline. The attribute timeline 0, 1 means that at the start frame the value will be 0 and the chosen end frame the value will be 1. This could be used to make the point scale grow over time. Now for a more complicated looking attribute. Timeline 20%, 50%, 80% equals 0, 1, 0. This value would stay at 0 until the timeline has passed 20%. Then it would start to rise, peaking in the middle with a value of 1. Then return to 0 at 80% of the timeline. IsActive and age attributes are only effective if the wind modifier is used. Every active particle in a wind simulation has the attribute age. Each frame that a particle is active, its age will increase, getting older and older as the timeline progresses. Baking. Any type of animation in Blender can be performance heavy, as each frame, new information needs to be calculated. If you're happy with a modifier's settings and effects, you can bake its data so that the information no longer needs to be calculated. This will give smooth playback for that specific modifier. However, changing its settings would no longer have any effect until the baked data is deleted. If a modifier's data is baked, its settings will become grayed out and a warning will show. Hitting bake will bake that modifier's data. It will take a few seconds for the data to bake, and a progress bar will be shown on the status bar. Hitting the trash icon will delete the data. Due to some Blender limitations, the add-on may sometimes think your modifier has baked data when it doesn't. Pressing the trash icon will effectively refresh the bake status and fix this issue if it occurs for you. Decimate. Decimate will remove a percentage of points from your object before animating anything. This is only really necessary on incredibly large point clouds or when using lower end machines. Crop box. This allows you to specify a crop object or collection and a method of cropping. Points inside, outside, or by distance to the crop objects can be removed. Like Decimate, this removes points before any animation occurs, which can be useful for performance. The crop object and distance threshold can be keyframed for some interesting animation effects. The wind modifier. The wind modifier will animate points traveling in a specific direction. You first need to specify whether your input equals points or a mesh. If you select mesh, you can set the mesh face scale. The default uses the attribute timeline 1 to 0, making the mesh faces shrink over time. The number of points that are animated is controlled with selection. This can be controlled by an attribute or by the selection factor. Selection factor is a percentage of the total number of points that are animated. This value can be keyframed for full control. The selection can be limited by a mask object on mask collection. Objects inside, outside, or by distance to the mask object or objects can be animated, similar to the crop box functions. The direction that particles travel is upwards by default, but an object can be specified to control the direction. The arrow object from the Add Effector menu is perfect for this. The wind strength will control the max distance each particle travels each frame. The random mix will control the percentage of particles that travel a fraction of the top speed. The random divider will determine what fraction the randomly affected particles will travel. It sounds confusing, but a value of 2 would make the randomly affected particles travel at half speed. A value of 4 would make them travel at quarter speed. The Morph modifier. The Morph modifier takes an input object and transforms it into a selected second object. In input-output, you choose if you want an input point cloud to transform into another point cloud, or an input mesh to transform into a mesh. If you select points to points, you must specify whether the target equals a mesh or the target equals points. If the target equals points, you must specify the object. If the target point colors seem dull or a little washed out, try toggling linearize color, but this setting isn't usually needed. If the target equals a mesh, you must choose the object and the mesh color texture. The noise modifier. The noise modifier will displace point positions. It's great for adding a further layer of complexity to wind or morph effects, making them look more organic and dynamic looking. First, you must specify if your input equals points or a mesh. The settings for each choice are the same as the wind and noise modifiers. The points noise type determines the noise texture that is used to displace the points. It could be a regular noise pattern, Voronoi, or a combination of the two. Points noise strength will control the strength of the displacement. Attribute influence can be used to multiply the chosen strength. Points noise scale will control the size of the noise pattern. Again, attribute influence can be used. Points noise phase will make the noise pattern evolve over time and can be influenced by attributes. If you chose input equals mesh, the mesh settings will be shown. Mesh effects will let you choose if the mesh has no noise effects, or if only the face scale changes, or if the face scale changes and the mesh is displaced. If the mesh is displaced, you'll be shown settings identical to the points noise settings, but for settings that only affect the mesh. The snap to shape modifier. This modifier will force points to snap to the position of a chosen grid of shapes. Enabling preview shapes will let you see the grid of shapes that your points are snapping to. You can enable this while adjusting grid and shape settings. Grid movement will control if the grid is a fixed size and shape that doesn't move, with grid is static, or if the grid adjusts to the overall simulation size, you use grid morphs to bounds. Grid points will control the number of points on the X, Y, and Z axes of the grid. If you set all of these to 1, you would produce a single shape for snapping. Grid translate, rotate, and scale allows you to control each of those elements for the grid. Shape lets you choose the shape that is instanced on each point of the grid. If you select Custom Object, you can specify the instant object. Shape Translate, Rotate, and Scale lets you affect these properties of the individual shapes on the grid. Selection lets you choose what percentage of points are affected by the modifier, and this can be influenced by attributes. Masking affects which points are affected by the modifier, exactly the same as masking for the wind modifier. Effect strength will mix between the point's current position and the snapped position. The wireframe modifier. This modifier will connect points by wires, producing web-like or plexus effects. Single or multiple will determine whether the curves are composed of one single continuous curve or many multiple curves. Different settings are available for each choice. Point order determines in which order points are connected. No weighting from the center, by axis, or by distance to an object. Selection determines what percentage of points are connected by wires. Masking settings are exactly the same as those found in Snap to Shape and Wind. Curve resolution determines the resolution of each curve, but increasing this can impact performance a lot. Curve min, max, and taper determines the overall scale of each curve. Taper will make curves shrink from one end to another, but it's barely noticeable if you're using a single curve. The scale can also be affected by attribute influence. Trim end will shrink the curves from one end to another. This can be useful for some growing effects and can also be controlled by attributes. Simplify is available when using a single curve. This will reduce the total number of points in a curve. Fillet is also only available when using a single curve. This will round the corners of a curve, giving a more looping effect. Shading. By default, the animated objects will be given the point animate material. This material comes preloaded with all of the available attributes produced by the animation modifiers. Using these attributes for shading is a huge topic. For beginners who don't totally understand shaders, you can still use this material as an example of what's possible when using attributes to control various parameters. Just have a play around and see what's possible. Extra resources. If you need any help while using the modifier, the documentation button will launch a web browser opening a page with the add-ons documentation. The tutorial video button will launch a web browser opening a page with this video documentation in case you ever lose it. And See All Add-ons on Blender Market will open a web browser for our add-on marketplace. If you need some free models to animate, we update the KIRI app homepage each week with new free models to download. If you make some cool scans with the KIRI Engine app, or you make some cool renders with this add-on, please consider sharing them on our Discord.